Thanks for joining us. Latest in Bitter's long line, it seems now, of webinars, weekly webinars covering different aspects and hopefully providing some help and tips and guidance to sort of navigate through, getting through what we're in now and getting back to some kind of normality and getting back to work and getting our businesses up and running. Richard, good afternoon. I hope you're well. Richard is the MD from Peopletime. Your specialist subject, shall we say, is HR, payroll and health and safety. But I think we're going to basically concentrate today on the HR side of it, if that's all right with you, Richard. I think that's what we're sort of here for this afternoon. But any questions that come through, we'll do our best to answer as best as possible. Richard, you just want to give to sort of start the ball rolling, give us a bit of a brief outline of you and your business. That's okay.
That's right. Thank you, Jim, and thanks for asking me to run the webinar this afternoon. So yes, I'm Richard Hare, joint owner of Peopletime. We've been around since 2006, and we provide, as you mentioned, payroll, HR, and health and safety support to businesses that want to outsource that. What I want to talk about and focus on this afternoon is, unfortunately, a very pertinent topic that we're finding in our business, and that's how can employers cut their employment costs. By necessity, it's a relatively brief webinar, so this is sort of an overview of different options, things for people to think about when they're faced with these difficult decisions of reducing costs. So I have to start with a health warning and say, as it's an overview, when you're looking at your own business, make sure that if you're not confident about what we're talking about, get some expert help to help you with it, because it's very easy to fall foul of employment legislation when you're dealing with people's contracts and changing them or indeed terminating them.
Yeah, I think as much as the guidelines there, Richard, sorry to interrupt, I think it's definitely a subject that's not one size fits all, and you should seek help for each business has its own specific issues that they have to face.
Right, absolutely right. As I say, we have been getting a lot of requests from our clients to help in this area. Unfortunately, probably the biggest now, as the furlough scheme starts to change and morph into something that's a little less supportive, is now the focus on making people redundant. So I'm going to give that a little bit more of a detailed look if we've got time during this presentation. But let me kick off then, if I may, and maybe talk about the different options. So starting with the furlough scheme that you mentioned there, it has been a very beneficial scheme for many of our clients. Probably most people are familiar with it now. So the government is providing support to employers to the tune of 80% of their furloughed employees' salaries, up to a cap of £2,500, plus the employer's NI and some limited pension contribution support there as well. That scheme is changing over the next month or two. So there's two key changes coming in. From the 1st of July, there's going to be the ability to furlough people for periods of less than 21 days. We are expecting actually much more detailed guidance on that from tomorrow, so I'm not going to dwell on that. And then from the 1st of August, the scheme, the amount of the financial support of the scheme will gradually wind down over the following 3 months. The real big benefit of the scheme, though, is it's given employers breathing space to think about how they run their businesses going forward in the different environment. It may not stop, it will not stop all redundancies, as we're already finding out, but at least it's allowing employers to plan and address things in a measured way, give them time to think about, what will my business need to look like and how can I get there without it being too much of a knee-jerk reaction. So it's a great scheme, and it's really helped, but it's limited in life, and so employers are now starting to think, okay, it's going to come to an end, what do I do? So other options then, salary reduction. Now that's something that in the past, you wouldn't get many employees agreeing a salary reduction, but we have found in these times that people are realistic. They know that it's a really strange economic environment, and if they want to help preserve their jobs, then tough decisions have to be made. And so we have had lots of clients who have said, yeah, we've got our employees, can we get our employees to agree salary reductions? And yes, it's been possible and surprisingly easy in many cases, because people at the end of the day are realistic, and also often, in these times of giving of their, sacrificing themselves. So, we've seen 20, 30% salary reductions across the board, sometimes for a limited period, and sometimes, at the moment, open-ended. Key thing to remember, of course, is these have to be done by agreement. Otherwise, you're going to face potential claims. So that's one option, and that's not usually on the table, but it is at the moment.
I think maybe some people, the realistic approach is to say, well, 70% of something is better than 100% of nothing, I suppose, in simple terms, isn't it?
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. And then linked to that, and possibly a little more palatable, is rather than taking just a straight salary cut and working the same hours, is actually agreeing a reduction in the working hours. So at least, from the employer perspective, if you're only getting 70% of your salary, at least you're only doing 70% of the total time. And again, that is in this current climate something that we've been able to get agreement to in several cases. So those are two things well worth looking at.
Has the subject, just does the subject of maybe, obviously you've got specific circumstances, but things like job share and things like that come up?
Yeah, that is another option. If you've got a workforce that is flexible, or maybe multi-talented, then it's certainly a good practice to look at, okay, fine, the business as a whole is running at 70% of what it normally does. Can we spread the load differently, share jobs so that everyone shares the pain equally? And that is certainly worth looking at. Very briefly, there's in certain sectors, often blue-collar environments, there is often a contractual right to lay people off, i.e. if there's no work available, you can actually, as the employer, say, okay, there's nothing to be done here, unfortunately, we're going to lay you off. And that gives the employees the rights to a small payment from the government, very small payment from the government of £30 a day, up to a maximum of £150, i.e. 5 days. It's obviously nothing like as good as the furlough scheme, but if you've got a workforce which maybe you can't, in the circumstances where you can't furlough them, then it's better than nothing. Turning then to the big one, redundancy. This is a fairly complex process, even in straightforward circumstances. So it's well worth planning it properly from the outset, thinking about what am I trying to achieve here before you even open your mouth to employees. So beginning with the end in mind, as you say, but be prepared to be flexible and open-minded. A few sort of ground rules, depending on the number of employees that you're looking to make redundant, different rules apply. So if you're having to make 20 plus employees redundant, for example, then you are required to have employee representatives in place to consult with during the redundancy consultation process. Now, many employers haven't got representatives in place at the moment, or they didn't have, because they weren't they weren't expecting to make redundancies, but now they have to have them in place, and that involves electing employee representatives if there is no established employee forum or trade union representation in that business. So before you can even start consultation, you need to be aware that you need to have those reps in place once you hit 20 plus employee redundancies. Another implication of having 20 plus employees being made redundant is that the consultation period itself has to last a minimum 30 days. And you also have to notify the government on what's called an HR1 form that you are planning these redundancies. It's actually a criminal offence not to do so, so beware of that one.
Not want to miss out on.
And then if you get to the situation where you're making more than 99 people redundant, then there's another hurdle, which is that you have to give consultation process at least 45 days time to consult with the employees there. So there's rules around the process that you need to be aware of before you even start it. Those are some of them. And once you actually get into the process, you've got your reps there, there are other potential decisions to make. So for example, if you have a pool of employees and you need to make some of them redundant, you've got choices to make about who they are. Now, the key here is to make sure that you are objective and seem to be objective about the criteria that you...
There's some kind of rationale behind it, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. What you want to avoid is any sort of smell of discrimination, whether that's direct or indirect, because you open yourselves up potentially to a large claim there.
Yeah.
So be very careful on that point. Now,
I mean, just sorry to interrupt, but just on that point, like a rationale or some criteria for the selection process, it could be as simple as last in, first out, or you could do an audit of skills for what the business needs, what the business changes, and match that to individuals.
Yeah, I think much more likely to be the latter. What you want to do is end up with a workforce that is best placed to help your business thrive going forward. So it is an opportunity to make sure that you look at the skills you need in the business as it's going to look going forward.
And then match that to the individuals you've got in your group or in your workforce, rather than the individuals matching what you
need.
You start going to the muddy waters of discriminatory claims. That's right.
That's right. You're spot on, Jim. Always remember it's the role that's redundant, not the person. Yes. So you shouldn't be thinking about the personalities as your first port of call when you're looking at redundancies. Now, of course, as a pragmatic employer, you do want to make sure you retain the employees who are best going to help your business. So it doesn't mean that you have to be blind to the fact that some employees have better skills than others. It's not a random selection, it's a selection.
It's just demonstrating somewhere that's documented that you've actually been through that process, I suppose, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Documentation is key. So that if you're in the unfortunate position of facing a claim, you can show you've been objective and you've followed the correct process. HR is, 90% about getting the process right. So whilst, clients are worried about claims from redundancy, if they get it wrong, it's not wrong to make people redundant. It's just wrong to do it in the wrong way, i.e. an unfair way. So our job is to make sure that employers do it the right way.
Can I, we've got questions coming through, Richard. Sorry to interrupt you. I know you've got things that you want to cover, but we've got some questions that we had before we started the webinar, but there's one or two starting to come through live. So can I jump on them as they come through? Is that all right?
Yeah, fire away. If you want to jump in now.
Yeah, well, I'll dive in on the first one now from Gary Jesson. Thanks for joining us, Gary. Question is, when trying to have the workforce or get the workforce to agree to reduce a reduction in hours, how would you deal with the scenario of, say, the majority of your workforce agreeing to, but one or two don't?
Okay,
that's a real issue. That is going to happen without doubt.
It is. So as I said before, you can't impose a material change on someone's employment contract without their consent. So you can by all means go ahead and agree with the employees who will agree, and then you're left with the ones who don't. And then you have to decide, okay, what am I going to do with these guys or girls? And the answer is it will depend on the circumstances. But ultimately,
You're not far from, if I've got 10 employees and 8 of them agree to a reduction in hours,
yeah,
2 of them don't, I can still start making arrangements for the 8 who agree to put them onto reduced hours. Now,
yes,
realistically, that's going to cause an issue in the workplace, isn't it, I suppose. So this is where it comes back to handling each situation on its own merits, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, aside from a unionised environment where you've got collective agreement in place,
Yeah.
There's certainly nothing that's going to stop you agreeing individually with those 8 employees and then dealing with the other 2 employees separately. And it may be that the other 2 employees then start, they're potentially redundant, because if the business does not need those full-time roles, and it can justify saying, look, we have no requirement for these roles full-time anymore, we only have part-time roles, then they can potentially be redundant. There's obviously a proper process to be followed through there. But it's a question of horses for courses, dealing with them individually depending on the circumstances. Okay.
I mean, one or two of the others. I mean, just speaking about redundancy. You maybe have already answered this, I think, but if you do have to make some of your employees redundant, I know what the answer to this is going to be before I ask it, but can I use it as an opportunity to exit difficult employees?
Yes, potentially.
Probably very tempting.
Yeah, if you do it in the right way, potentially, because a difficult employee may well be one that has problems with discipline, and a disciplinary record may be one of the objective criteria you use when you're selecting employees to retain or not their jobs.
Timekeeping, things like that.
So the skill here is to make sure that you identify what you require from the workforce going forward, and then select accordingly, but objectively. You're right. You can't just say, well, I don't like Joe because he's a stroppy little beggar. But on the other hand, that stroppy little beggar may actually translate into a poor disciplinary record.
I'm going to give my colours away. If I've got 9 Evertonians and 1 Liverpudlian, I can't use this to get shit the Liverpudlian.
I don't think
that wouldn't stand.
Being a Liverpudlian is probably not a protected characteristic. So you're all right from a discrimination point of view, but no, you have to follow an objective process.
I don't mean to make light of it.
Yeah.
If another question, if I outsource someone's role, would you then have to make them redundant?
No, not necessarily, although that might be a consequence. So if you outsource, what you're doing there is basically saying, this particular work I'm no longer going to retain in my business. I'm going to get someone outside the business to do it. But the work still exists. And under regulations called the TUPE regulations, the employee who is doing that work should transfer automatically to the new, to the person who's now going to undertake the work for you. Right. So, for example, if we take on a large payroll contract from a third party, and they've got an in-house payroll manager who does it normally, then the presumption is that payroll manager will transfer across to us, and we will then continue to employ them. However, that being said, there are often good reasons why they won't want to transfer. For example, if they live down in Cornwall, they're not going to want to work in Buckingham. That will then usually give rise to a redundancy situation, because the workplace is no good for them.
Just pure logistics. Yeah.
Exactly. Or we may find that actually, because we can run the payroll so much more efficiently, we don't actually need any more staff. And then again, there's a potential redundancy situation arising. But as I say, the presumption is that at the starting point is that their work and their employment will transfer
automatically.
Yeah.
I mean, just on the 2 subjects you've probably spoken about there, if somebody's actually on furlough at the moment, can they be made redundant? And what's the knock-on effect then for the furlough pay that the business is getting?
Okay. The government has not published a great deal around this subject, but in one piece of their guidance, it does imply that yes, employees can be subject to redundancy whilst on furlough. So on that basis, I say a qualified yes, that employees can be made redundant whilst on furlough, and logically it's not going to make sense if you can't do it. However, one key point to remember as an employer is that, of course, when you are making redundancies, you have a duty to look at reasonable alternatives. You know, you've got a duty to try and avoid making redundancies if you reasonably can. Yeah. And of course, one thing available to employers at the moment is the furlough scheme. So you have to make sure that you can demonstrate that you've considered whether you can use the furlough scheme as an alternative to redundancy. Yeah. So I think you said had another part to that question, which I've probably not answered.
No, I mean, I suppose the link to it slightly is that well, yeah, I think you've answered it about in terms of claims for the furlough pay. If you are looking to make somebody redundant while they're on furlough, then naturally, obviously, you obviously can't make the claim as a business for somebody you're making redundant, you have made redundant.
Yes, once they, say they're working out their notice period whilst they're being made redundant, then yes, whilst they're still working, then you should be able to make that as part of your furlough claim under the coronavirus job retention scheme.
Right. I mean, the other one's linked to furlough really is that can I make employees take holidays while they're on furlough, and how much would you then have to pay them if they did?
Okay. Yep, the answer is it's a clear yes on that one. You can require employees to take holidays. Indeed, whether they're on furlough or not, there is legislation which allows employers to specify when their employees take their holiday, subject to any contractual arrangements that they may have. Now, the rule is that you have to give twice as much notice as a minimum compared to the amount of holiday that they're going to be required to take. So if you want an employee to take a week's holiday, you have to give them at least 2 weeks' notice.
Yeah.
So many of our clients, as the furlough situation has gone on, have realised that actually we've got to get people taking a holiday.
Well, you're storing up a potential issue, that's right.
Exactly that, yeah. Otherwise, we're going to sort of start working towards the back end of the year and they're going to take holiday, having had a massive amount of time off.
If as an employer then, I mean, the second part of that question is, if I'm not topping up their pay with the additional 20% and they're just receiving the 80% furlough money that the government's providing, when they're on holiday, am I then obliged to top it up to 100%?
That's right. Yeah, so holiday pay has to be at the 100%, so you have to top up. Similarly, if someone's given notice, say they're being made redundant, then whilst it's still a bit of a debated question, I think probably you're required to pay their notice pay at 100% rather than the 80%.
Right. Well, from a business point of view as well, I mean, unfortunately, I was following the bank crash 12, 11 years ago. The business I was co-director of, we did go through a couple of rounds of redundancies. So I know we're talking around the legislation and the process and that, but there's obviously a big human aspect to this as well. So it's not an easy process, obviously, for the person receiving the news, but also for the person delivering it, which I know from first-hand experience. Yes. So, and it's not something you sort of train for, I don't suppose. So from your point of view, your role is there to support the business owner as well in terms of from the human aspect, I suppose.
That's right. We hold the business owner's hand figuratively from both a process point of view, making sure they get it right, and, as you say, from that human point of view. And unfortunately, this is a process I've had to put people through many times. Yeah, and I always tell myself, because you feel bad for the individual people, is you're actually, it's about preserving other people's jobs, preserving the business. If you don't take the hard decisions, then unfortunately the whole lot may come crashing down and then you've lost many more jobs. Yeah. So whilst to each individual person who's affected, it's tough, it's about the greater good, if you like.
I think that you keep that at the back of your mind, and what did help us is some of the things that you've mentioned and the preparation side of it as an owner in terms of basically getting everything in order and making sure that you followed the correct process and that the levels of, the lines of communication are clear, and you try and handle it as sensitively but as business-like as possible.
Yeah, I mean, communication is
the outcome for me is that each time we had to go through two redundancies. Fortunately, in both occasions, the guys who were being made redundant actually shook my hand at the end of it. And I think a lot of that was down to the people I had around us giving us guidance and making sure we had things in place and we did it properly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely right. People want to feel that they have been treated fairly. At the end of the day, most people can get their heads around what's going on at the moment. They know, if the business is really suffering, they know that hard decisions have to be made. And if you treat them fairly and with respect, good communication is key, then you're right. Hopefully they will end up saying, okay, I understand why this has happened and thank you for dealing with me the way you've dealt with me.
Yeah. They're not going to thank you for making them redundant, but they can thank you for how they handled it. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. And of course, joking aside, there are some people who actually, may welcome the opportunity of voluntary redundancy, and that's something to be explored.
That's right.
At the outset. As I was mentioned, it's a duty of the employer to look at alternatives to redundancy, or these compulsory redundancy. So, you can look for volunteers, not just for losing their jobs totally, but maybe for hours reductions, working more flexibly, with less hours. So it may be possible to reduce costs in other ways without the actual amount of job losses that you sort of start out anticipating.
We've just got another question in from Gary as well. The first week of test and tracing identified 31,000 close contacts of people testing positive, of which 26,985 have been asked to self-isolate. As an employer, can I just pay SSP if self-isolating person if the self-isolating person cannot work from home? What happens if an employee is unfortunate enough to be contacted multiple times to self-isolate and could effectively be out of work for weeks? So suppose that again revolves around the cost to the employer if somebody has been contacted and instructed to self-isolate as a result of track and trace.
Yeah, I think those who are required to self-isolate can be placed on furlough, and therefore at the moment you're recovering the costs from the government, assuming the employee agrees, which in these circumstances you think they would.
So they don't have to rely on statutory sick pay, they can actually still pay furlough.
That's right, yes. If they're required to shield, then you can put them on furlough rather than SSP. So that's generally the answer. As I say, there's changes potentially afoot, so we'll need to look at whether those rules change, but at the moment that's the situation.
Right. Another one that I've seen snippets of information on this, mainly on LinkedIn, because obviously when we're talking about redundancy, it's born out of the fact that you're trying to streamline the business and cut overheads and cut costs. Unfortunately, there is a cost involved to the business of redundancy, isn't there? And it can, by making somebody redundant, it can have depending on the length of service and what have you, it could have a significant impact on your cash flow. Now, as I said, I've sort of come across something very, very briefly regarding the redundancy payment scheme, which is coming on board, which I think is some kind of government assistance, is that? So to flatten out the cash flow issues for the business.
Okay. I'm not aware of any new scheme, but what I would term the redundancy payment scheme is where the employer is insolvent and therefore can't pay out the redundancy to the employees.
Right.
And then the employees don't lose out on their redundancy, that they can't get the money off their employer, so they can apply and get it through the redundancy payment scheme.
Right. Okay. But if a business is going to stay in business following the round of redundancies, is this an avenue to sort of seek help, or I don't know?
I'm not aware that there's any
support
for redundancy.
Maybe I've got Like everything at the moment, Richard, things are changing by the day, aren't they? So.
They are. I mean, it's been a very interesting time to be an HR advisor, I can tell you, because the rules have changed a lot on the furlough scheme as the weeks gone by.
How have you found it personally, your business? I bet the phone was absolutely ringing up.
Yeah, well, we actually got two sides to the business. So the HR and payroll side has been, yes, long hours and yeah, very, very busy. And then we've got a health and safety and fire safety training side. And for the most part, the guys there have been on furlough because, of course, training, for example, has been, absolutely prohibited in almost most cases. We're starting to see now a pick up on the fire risk assessment side as gradually businesses start to come back to work and they understand, what they need to do to be able to work safely. So yeah, and this part-time furlough arrangement that's coming in from next month, I think will help that business and obviously lots of similar businesses where demand is down, but there is still a need to have, to do some work.
Yeah. I think, as you said at the outset, I'm just looking, there's no more questions don't appear to be coming through. I mean, in summary, you have only had, it's been 30 minutes, so you've literally scratched the surface. So similar to last week when we covered health and safety, it's very much seek guidance. There's help out there, whether it's through the bitter community or whatever, but there is help out there, and basically before you do anything, whether it's to put some plans together for the redundancy program, whether it's putting a health and safety risk assessment together, which we covered last week, it's go out and speak to the experts before you do it yourself.
That's right, and we're actually saying to all bitter members, if you want to have an obligation chat about your options, then just give us a call. Either myself or one of my HR colleagues would be happy to just talk through what you need to be thinking about when you're faced with these choices, just as a sounding board, if nothing else. And then if you need further help, we're obviously happy to do that, as a client. So yeah, very welcome.
The message is you're not alone. There's help out there.
Indeed.
Right. Have you got anything else you wanted to specifically cover, Richard, before we hand over? Or you?
I think we sort of, whilst we've diverged off on questions, that's covered quite a few of the points that I was going to make. So it's probably rather than me try and dive back into the detail now, it's probably best to sort of end on that note. It's an overview. There's options. Give us a call if you need some help.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Richard.
Thank you, Jim. Good to speak to you.
Back to you. Good to speak to you.
Thanks.
Okay, so thank you so much to Jim Forshaw of our Liverpool board and Richard Hare of Peopletime for hosting that seminar for us. I think there's some really interesting points there, so thank you for your insight. For all of those that joined slightly late, I want to let you know that we have been recording this seminar and it's going to be on our YouTube and on our Bitter Community Hub. That's bittercommunity.org before the end of the day, so you can access it and download it from there. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good evening.
And you, thanks, Laura.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, Richard. Bye.